Hello and welcome back to Jenna Gets Creative. Today we are starting a brand new series on this channel. I am calling it Overdue Art Supply Reviews, or Overdue Reviews for short. And yes, I am shamelessly borrowing this, if you've heard of it, from the Overdue Doctor Who series on Council of Geeks, where they review Doctor Who episodes long after they came out. So the plan for this series is I will be doing this, split screen format, where over here on the vertical side, I will be reviewing a product, and over there on the slightly larger side, I will be doing a demonstration with the item that I am reviewing. The things I will be reviewing on this series are going to be things that I have owned for at least 6 months, regardless of whether or not they're my favorite things to use. And the requirement will be that either I've never reviewed them before, beyond maybe like an unboxing first impressions type video, or there is a good reason to do a second review. Either it's been a very long time, like in this case, I have had this for 3 years, and I'm not even sure if I ever did a review on it. Maybe it's something that the product has changed since I last reviewed it, maybe I've got more of it, or maybe just through use my opinion on it has significantly changed. In this review series, not only will I be showing you the product, going over it, reviewing it, giving my impression on it, I will actually do a deep dive and research the product as well and give you as much information as possible. So to kick it off, since I love watercolors, why not do my tried and true Winsor Newton Cotman Pocket palette. Here's a nice close-up look of the closed palette. This is plastic. It's fairly solid, fairly rigid. It does have a bit of a texture to it here. And as we open it up, there are 3 large wells on the lid, there are 12 half pans, and there is a little travel paintbrush that comes with it. I usually don't use this one. I will get into that in a sec. You can, if you are careful, detach the palette lid. Of course, pans go flying. And I do like to do this for cleaning purposes so that I'm not getting all the paint sweat. It's easier to take this off than to remove all of those palettes. But of course, do be careful. It is just plastic. Eventually, it will get brittle. This is the included brush. This is called a Sceptre Gold brush. It is a round brush. It is meant, this handle, this is a hollow tube. This is meant to come apart and be a cap, a protective cap on this. It's only a half size. When mine came, this was unfortunately a little bit dented. It didn't properly fit and stay like this. I did have to use pliers and persuade it. So if I get a real close-up look, you can see a lot of tool marks on it. So this is permanently attached now. I don't undo it. I'm not a fan of travel size brushes. They're just so short, but I did find it, grab it, put it back in here for the purpose of showing you what comes in the palette. To be fair and true to Winsor Newton here, I will exclusively use Winsor Newton brushes in my review. I have several Cotman brushes, I have several Winsor Newton special value brushes, and I do also have one Winsor Newton professional synthetic sable brush. Just in comparison here, this Cotman script brush is a size 1. I would say that this travel brush, clearly it's a round because it's a shorter one. It's either a 1 or a 2. Not my favorite size, but it's nice, it works. I have gone ahead and done some research into these paints, so I will tell you what the 12 colors are, and as I go through, I will talk about the pigment information, light fastness, permanence, all of that kind of stuff. I do want to mention that out of the 12 pans here, 8 of them do have a light fastness rating, and the remaining 4 are not yet tested. That doesn't mean they aren't light fast. All of the pigments I researched for this did report having a good amount of light fastness and permanence. That just means that this particular formulation, the combination of pigments and the binders and all that kind of stuff, has not been tested. This is a student grade watercolor set. Watercolors are generally rated either student grade or artist grade. Artist grades are the highest level, the professional quality. They will have a much higher ratio of pigment to the binder and any other items that go into it. Artist grades also tend to have the more expensive, the more refined, the rarer pigments. They will cost more mostly because of the pigments that go into them. They will generally have the genuine pigment if it is safe to use. They will generally have fewer pigments. You are much less likely to find a multi-pigment color in a professional artist grade set. In a student grade set, these are still perfectly acceptable to use. Some companies, when they say student grade, they are telling you that it is a very low quality starter kind of kit, something you would actually give a child or a teenager or somebody who's just doing watercolor as part of their crafting, and it doesn't particularly matter what kind of quality it is. Other brands, like Winsor Newton, when they say student grade, they're just meaning this is their cheaper line. They might have done a little bit of pigment mixing, they might have a little bit more binder in it, but they are still excellent paints. Out of all of the student grade watercolors out there that I've tried, this is definitely one of the best. The only other one I like just as much is the Van Gogh from Royal Talons. For reference, this set costs $29.99 Canadian at Curry's, and that is the regular MSRP. That works out to $2.50 per half pan if you are not counting the price of the palette itself and the brush. They don't currently sell the half pans individually, so I can't compare to what they're listing individual pans at. Dick Blick is selling it for $21.84 US dollars. The list price, the MSRP, is reportedly $31.79. Their sale price works out to $1.82 per half pan, which is an excellent deal considering they're selling the half pans at the suggested list price of $5.35. Over in the UK, Jackson's Art Supply is selling this set for £14.20. That is down from the RRP of £23.75. Their sale price works out to £1.98 per half pan, which is just 2 cents cheaper than their £2 half pan individual open stock price. Starting top left, we have Lemon Yellow Hue, Cadmium Yellow Hue, Cadmium Red Pale Hue, Alizarin Crimson Hue, Ultramarine, Cerulean Blue Hue, Viridian Hue, Sap Green, Yellow Ochre, Burnt Sienna, Burnt Umber, and Chinese White. Lemon Yellow Hue. This is a single pigment. It is classified as a monoazo pigment. The pigment in this one is PY175 benzimidazolone yellow. Very sorry, I did take chemistry. It's been a long time.
Benzimidazolone.
This has an opacity rating of transparent, a permanence rating of A. Side note there, when Winsor Newton rates permanence, AA is extremely permanent and A is permanent. We don't have any other permanence ratings, so I won't tell you what they are. Permanence refers to how much the pigment stains the paper. So when you put this paint down, let it dry, and then either try to lift it or scrape it off the page. Has it stained the paper, or are you scraping off to a clean white fresh page? All of these do have an A or AA permanence rating, so all of these should stain the page. The light fastness of Lemon Yellow Hue is not tested. I do believe that PY175 is supposed to be fairly light fast, so that must just mean that this particular formulation with the binders and anything else present has not been tested. Cadmium Yellow Hue. This is 2 pigments, a monoazo and an organic pigment. We have PY65 Hansa Yellow and PY97 Permanent Yellow. Opacity is transparent. Permanence is rated A, and light fastness is not tested. Cadmium Red Pale Hue. 2 pigments, organic and monoazo. PR255 Coral Red and PR65 Hansa Yellow. Opacity is transparent, permanence is rated A, and light fastness is not tested. Alizarin Crimson is a single pigment. It is an organic. It is also typed as quinacridone. The pigment is PR206 quinacridone pyrrolidine red. Opacity is transparent, permanence is A, and light fastness is rated at 1. Winsor Newton is using ASTM light fastness ratings. ASTM light fastness ratings correspond to the blue wool scale. 1 is the highest possible value. 1 means that it has a blue wool rating of 7 or 8. 2 means it has a blue wool rating of 6. 3 means blue wool of 4 or 5. 4 means blue wool 2 or 3. V means blue wool 1. Everything that has a light fastness in this set is either a 1 or a 2, and both of those are considered sufficiently light fast for professional artist grade use. A blue wool rating of 7 or 8 means that it will last at least 100 years under museum conditions without shifting or fading. 6 means it's going to last somewhere between 50 and 100 years under museum conditions. It goes down from there. We don't have anything that's definitely rated under that, so I won't go over it. Where were we? Ultramarine. This is a single inorganic pigment, PB29 Ultramarine Blue. An actual organic, genuine, expensive ultramarine is just grinding up lapis lazuli. This is a synthesized version of ultramarine. It's not French ultramarine, it is a chemical synthesized version of that ground up lapis lazuli. Opacity is transparent, permanence is rated at A, and light fastness is 1. Cerulean Blue Hue, 1 pigment, organic. This is PB15 Phthalo Blue, also known as copper phthalocyanine. Opacity is O, opaque. Permanence is rated at A, and light fastness is rated at 2. Viridian Hue is a single organic pigment, PG7 Phthalo Green. Opacity is transparent, permanence is A, light fastness is 1. Sap Green is a mix of 3 pigments. That is the most pigments you're going to see in this set, and I suspect that that's true of just about every student grade Sap Green, because I find Sap Green is one of the ones that's going to granulate in a really chalky, unpleasant way. Let's see if that's my opinion of this exact one when we get to swatching, because I forget. This is a mix of organic and azomethine pigments, PG36 Phthalo Green, PR101 Mars Orange, PY139 Isoindolinone Yellow. Opacity is transparent, permanence is A, and light fastness is not tested. Yellow Ochre, 1 pigment, inorganic earth, PY42 Mars Orange. Note that there are multiple pigments called Mars Orange, different pigment than the one used in Sap Green. Opacity is opaque. Permanence is AA, extremely permanent. Light fastness is 1. Burnt Sienna, single pigment, PR101 Mars Orange. So this is the same Mars Orange in the Sap Green, but not the Yellow Ochre. Opacity is transparent, permanence is AA, light fastness is 1. Burnt Umber is 2 pigments, both earth type. We have PBR7 Burnt Umber and PY42 Yellow Iron Oxide. Opacity is opaque, permanence is AA, light fastness is 1. Last but not least, we have Chinese White, single pigment inorganic, PW5 Lithopone. This is a combination of zinc sulfide and barium sulfate. Opacity is opaque, permanence is AA, and light fastness is 1. I would also like to note here that generally, if you're going to get a white paint in watercolor, it's going to be Chinese White or Titanium White. Chinese White tends to be a bit more transparent than Titanium White. It also tends to have a bit of a blue underhue rather than the very pure, stark, chalky white of Titanium White. I think that's all I wanted to say about them before I get on with swatching. Let's go ahead and prep the paints. A good idea when you're working with watercolor paints is to just spritz them with some water. You can also get a dropper and just put a drop of water on them. Do this before you start, as you're getting ready, just to let the paints activate again. These do re-wet and activate very well, but I do find that unlike some that are super eager to re-wet, such as the Daler Rowney Aquafine, these ones do behave better if you give them a little bit of time with that mist water on top. Okay, so I'm ready to start with the swatching process. Before I start, I'm not sure if I mentioned it, so I will mention it now. In watercolors in general, but especially with Winsor Newton, when a paint name says hue, that just means that it is not the pigment that it's named after. So for example, cadmium yellow hue, cadmium red pale hue. Cadmium is toxic, so they've gone ahead and used something else that mimics the color of cadmium without actually using that dangerous cadmium chemical. It doesn't mean that it's a worse product or anything like that. Even the professional artist grade is going to be a hue rather than the authentic cadmium pigment, because we don't want to be putting cadmium anywhere near our skin. I have heard some artists here on YouTube get that wrong. They've said that anything called hue is dangerous. I do believe the first person I heard say that was working in oils, and there may be a different system for oils. I'm not sure. I'm not an oil painter. For watercolor, it just means that the pigment or mix of pigments being used are not the dangerous name in the color name, like cadmium. That's all it means. Doesn't mean anything bad for the paint. It doesn't mean it's a lesser quality paint. Lemon yellow hue. Remember that this one is claiming to be transparent. Let's get a lot on the brush and see how it blends out with more water. Cadmium Yellow Hue. Cadmium Red Pale Hue. Alizarin Crimson. Ultramarine. Cerulean Blue Hue. Viridian Hue. Sap Green. Yellow Ochre. Burnt Sienna. Burnt Umber. Chinese White. I'm going to pause the recording for a minute here, let these properly dry, and then we will talk about how much these swatches seem to agree with the information I already read you about the pigments. We will try some lifting, see that kind of stuff, and then we'll just switch to voiceover mode as I give my final opinions and tell you a little bit more about the piece that you've been watching over there. Lemon Yellow Hue, this is supposed to be transparent, and Permanence is not tested in terms of light fastness. As you can see with the box and this stripe here, it is fairly transparent. It forms a nice gradation here. There is no granulation. It is a very true pigment. Very nice, cool yellow, very versatile. Cadmium Yellow Hue. Transparent, single A rating Permanence, light fastness not tested. This is a double pigment. It is also proving to be quite transparent. There's a little bit of something happening here. I don't know how well you can see it on camera, where I started to go back through it with the paintbrush. That's okay. I think that was user error. I think I had too much water on the brush. I don't think that that is unexpected granulation. You might notice here that there is a darkening around the edge. Again, that could be too much water on the paintbrush, or that could be something to do with the pigments in this paint not quite agreeing as they're watered down. Cadmium Red Pale Hue, mix of two pigments, light fastness not tested. This is transparent and Permanence of single A. Yes, it is transparent. Yes, it does make a very nice gradient. Again, I am seeing a bit of darkening around that edge. Alizarin Crimson, transparent, Permanence of A, light fastness of 1. So this is the first one where we actually have a light fastness rating. This is completely light fast. It does appear to be transparent. I don't think I had enough paint on the page to start with. That's why this starts so much earlier. I do like this cauliflower blooming effect we're getting with it. Again, getting a little bit of a darkening around the edge. Ultramarine single pigment. This is supposed to be transparent. Permanence A, light fastness 1. It is transparent. You can see the black through here. You can't really see it here, but keep in mind this is a much darker color, so that's kind of to be expected. Very nice gradient here. Again, I think I used too much water. That's why we're seeing this abrupt shift right here. Edges are beautiful. Cerulean Hue. This is meant to be opaque. Permanence of A, light fastness of 2. I would not call this opaque at all. I hope you'll agree with me. I think Ultramarine is more opaque than Cerulean Blue Hue. It does make a nice gradient, but I think it faded off too quickly. This is not my favorite pigment in the set. Viridian Hue, transparent, Permanence A, light fastness 1. Yes, yes, very nice gradient. There is a little bit of granulation happening here. It is a nice, appealing granulation. Fades off beautifully, no darkening around the edges. Sap Green, the holy mix of 3 pigments. Not a fan of sap green in student grade watercolors. Don't know if you caught that. Transparent, Permanence of A, light fastness not tested. It is transparent. There is a lot of granulation in the spots where I just put the pigment down straight out of the pan. It forms a nice gradient. We do have the darkening around the edges. If I'm looking for granulation in a watercolor, I want to see granulation here where it's watered down, not here where I just put it on the page. This is why some people really don't like student grade watercolors, because in some cheaper student grade watercolor sets, all of them are going to do this. Yellow Ochre, opaque, Permanence double A, light fastness 1. Yes, this is fairly opaque. You can see through it a bit, but as you can see, it wouldn't take much to build up. This feels thicker on the page, kind of like that sap green, honestly. Granulation is barely there. Beautiful gradient, not seeing any darkening at the end. Burnt Sienna, transparent, AA permanence, light fastness 1. Yes, transparent. Probably used too much water here. That is not just the paint's granulation. Does make a nice gradient. I'm seeing just a little bit of an edge at the end here. Burnt Umber, opaque, AA permanence, light fastness 1. Yes, opaque. There's a little bit of granulation. It goes into a gradient very quickly and easily. Not much left at the end here, but there is a little bit of an edge. Finally, Chinese White, opaque, AA permanence, light fastness 1. It is somewhat opaque, definitely better than a lot of student grade whites, but again, this is not the purest white. This is a white paper and you can see where I put the paint. Let's do some scraping, see what happens. Honestly, I think I just cut the page there. Not a whole lot is happening with that scraping. That is a good sign if you want a fairly permanent paint. Not a good sign if you are looking for techniques that will scrape. Now let's try some lifting. The best way to lift watercolor pigment, if that's a technique you're going for, is to wait for it to completely dry, then get your wet brush, scrub it again, really activate it, then get some paper towel or a dry brush, press firmly, lift up. This is supposed to be permanent. It has left some color. You're going to get interesting effects this way. You're going to lift enough that you could try to put a different color on top. You're not going to lift all of it. I think it would be fairly boring if we sat here and tried to do it on all of them, but let's try a AA permanence. Looks like the only AA permanences are down here in the browns. I'm interested in the burnt umber. Ooh, that activates really easy. And as you can see, there is still color left on the page. I would say not as much as that ultramarine though. I'm not sure if that's a sign that I didn't have as much paint on the page, or if it's just because the ultramarine has had a bit longer to dry. Let's try the ochre and let's do it over here. As you can see, these reactivate quite well. That's good if you're looking for techniques that reactivate, but it means you do have to be careful when you are layering on top because you will start to reactivate the layer underneath. And there we go. Let's try a little bit of mixing, try a little color wheel action here. I'm going to use the crimson, I'm going to use the ultramarine, and you know what, these are warmish colors. Let's try the cadmium yellow. Ready for that blending? And let's try some pastels directly on the page with the white. Some watercolor purists will poo-poo the idea of including a white in a watercolor set because if you are mixing with white to get a lighter color, you are going to be making it more opaque, and a lot of purists want to use the white of the paper and the transparency of the paint, the nature of the paint itself. So to get a pink, you're going to want to use something that is quite pink, like the alizarin crimson, rather than using like a true cadmium hue and just water it down. I think that there is a time and place to use a white rather than trying to use transparency in the white of the page. I don't think anybody is 100% right or wrong. I have worked with little sampler palettes like this that have white. I've worked with ones that don't. I do prefer ones that don't, not necessarily because I agree with not using a white paint, but because the ones that don't tend to have a black or a Payne's gray. The piece I chose to paint today is based on a photo that I found on Pixabay. I generally find all of my reference photos on sites like Pixabay, where the photographers have released their photos under a Creative Commons or a GNU or a public domain license. I really liked the way this cute little rabbit was just posed there staring at whoever was capturing the photo, and I just loved how it made so much use of the natural colors of the environment, the yellows and the greens. I like how there's a little bit of blue in there. I definitely got to play with the vibrant yellows and show off the greens in this palette. In the photo, the rabbit is in focus. Some of the grass and vegetation in front of him is as well, but mostly the vegetation and particularly the background is very blurred out, very bokeh. So that's what I was going for, and I am happy with how the piece came out. You may notice that the whiskers almost turned disastrous, but I was able to lift some of it. This was a lot of fun working with just this palette again. Kind of reminded me of where I was 3 years ago and why I love Winsor Newton Cotman paints, why I love the brushes. I did mention before that although I am not one of the purists who doesn't believe in using a white, I would rather this palette have done away with the white in favor of putting in a black or a Payne's gray, and that that remains true. I had to do a lot of tricky mixing to get anything close to a black. Although you won't necessarily be able to pick out all of the 12 colors in the palette, I did use all 12 colors in the mixing process in this piece. When I was doing the background, you saw me putting down pure colors right out of the pan. When you saw me starting to paint the rabbit, the starting very pale brown color was the yellow ochre, and then I went in with the burnt umber for the darker details. But there is a little bit of every color in here. The color in the ears is that nice orange shade, the cadmium red pale hue, mixed with a tiny bit of the alizarin crimson and the Chinese white, and then really watered down. That's how I got that nice fleshy peach color. There is a little bit of blue introduced into the background, but I also mixed that into the browns and the greens to try to get that black color to use for the darkest parts. And since I wanted more variety in the greens in the foreground, after using the sap green as a base and then the Viridian hue for some of the starting details, I went ahead, used both yellows and some of the blues to mix a new green. If you're not really familiar with mixing colors, if you're really used to having a wide range of colors, or if you're just not used to color at all, you may think that a palette like this looks very small, very limiting, but it really isn't. You just have to play around and learn how to mix colors, learn how colors play together. Grab yourself a reference color wheel. You don't have to pay for one. You can just download one off the internet. If you are trying to work with watercolor in more of a purist fashion and you don't have a white, you are going to need to be very conscious of leaving the white of the paper available to you, and you are going to want to really learn how much water to use to make paler shades. If you are going to work with a white, if you're going to get a palette like this, consider the differences between Chinese white and titanium white. Titanium white is going to be a very pure, soft white. The Chinese white is chalkier and it does have a bit of a blue tone to it. And also keep in mind that while something like the Chinese white that is a bit opaque can be added back on top of your piece, it can add color back on top of other colors, it's not going to have the same effect as leaving the white of the page. Final thoughts. Overall, this is by far my favorite starter size student grade watercolor set. These paints are beautiful. They are fairly light fast. Once again, there are 4 paints out of the 12 that are not tested light fast, but the pigments they have used are generally considered to be highly light fast. These are all very nice and permanent. They water down and create a gradient nicely. Most of them don't granulate in a way that you don't want them to. The Viridian granulates beautifully in a wash, which is what you do want a watercolor to do. The sap green, sometimes that yellow ochre, they granulate on, you know, that first dip, that purest pigment. That may be a little less desirable. For the price, this is absolutely worth it. If you are looking for a good watercolor to get into watercolor, to try it, to graduate from the cheap dollar store cakes that you use as a kid or use at your elementary school, this is the thing to buy. This will help you make wonderful, beautiful pieces, particularly if you are looking to do illustrative work, cartoony work, stuff like that, or if you're going to do a watercolor base and put other media on top. If you are already really skilled with watercolor, if you are selling your pieces, if you're trying to put them in shows and museums, and you're worried about light fastness without adding sprays, without putting it behind UV glass, that kind of thing, it may be worth it to you to save up and invest in a artist grade set. If you're looking for more to watch, I've got some suggestions up on the left side of the screen now. Don't forget to like, comment, maybe even subscribe, and if you like living life creatively, whatever that means to you, I'd love to have you along for the ride. Bye guys!